Easter Island and you look at the sites there, the statues, the megalithic walls, you realize they're much older than what, history tells us.
What archaeologists just discovered buried under Easter Island has scientists absolutely terrified. For over 200 years, we thought these were just heads, simple stone faces. But when they started digging, they found something that should be impossible. 30-foot giants with their eyes wide open, secret chambers that were never meant to be found, and a warning carved in a language that vanished overnight. The statues weren't staring at the ocean. They were watching something else, something we can't see. What they're hiding will make your blood run cold.
Every Moai statue is essentially a gravestone, but with a twist.
In the early 2000s, archaeologists began a systematic excavation project that would change everything we thought we knew about Easter Island. When the first team began carefully removing soil from around the base of one Moai, they expected to find the bottom of the head, perhaps sitting on a simple platform. Instead, their tools struck more stones. They kept digging, more stone. They dug deeper. And what emerged from beneath centuries of accumulated earth was something nobody had anticipated. These were not just heads. They were complete figures, full bodies that had been standing upright for hundreds of years before gradually becoming buried by natural processes. Soil erosion, volcanic ash, and windblown sediment had slowly covered them, leaving only the heads visible above ground. The archaeologists had uncovered torsos, arms, and in some cases, bodies that extended nearly 10 meters below the surface. The implications were staggering. If these weren't just heads, then everything about how we understood their construction, their purpose, and the civilization that created them needed to be reconsidered. The Moai suddenly became far more complex, far more impressive, and far more mysterious than anyone had imagined. As excavation teams worked across different sites on the island, patterns began to emerge. The buried bodies weren't simply rough-cut stone pillars. They had been carved with remarkable detail. Arms were positioned carefully across the torsos, hands meeting at the abdomen in a gesture that appeared both ceremonial and deliberate. The backs of several statues revealed intricate carvings that had been hidden from view for centuries. Spirals, circular patterns, and symbolic markings covered the stone, each one carved with precision despite being intended for a surface that would face away from viewers. These weren't decorative afterthoughts. The detail and care taken with parts of the statue that would never be seen suggested that the carving process itself held deep significance. Every surface mattered. Every detail carried meaning. The builders weren't creating monuments to impress observers. They were creating something sacred, something where every element had to be perfect, regardless of whether anyone would see it. The size of the complete statues was equally remarkable. While the visible heads had always seemed large, the full figures revealed proportions that dwarfed initial estimates. Some of the excavated Moai stood nearly 10 meters tall when fully exposed. The largest discovered specimens would have towered over the landscape at roughly the height of a 3-story building. Moving and positioning objects of this scale would have required extraordinary organization, engineering knowledge, and community coordination. But perhaps the most significant revelation wasn't about the statues themselves. It was about where they were looking. For generations, the popular image of Easter Island showed the Moai facing outward toward the sea, as if watching for ships or staring into eternity across the empty Pacific. This image appeared in countless books, documentaries, and travel guides. It became the accepted truth. The excavations proved this image false. When researchers mapped the orientation of Moai across the island, they found that the vast majority faced inland, not toward the ocean. They were positioned around the perimeter of ancient village sites, their backs to the sea, their weathered faces turned toward the communities that had created them. These were not sentinels watching for external threats. They were guardians looking after their own people. This reorientation of our understanding changed the entire narrative of Easter Island society. The Moai weren't monuments to isolation or symbols of a people staring longingly at a world they'd left behind. They were protectors, positioned deliberately to watch over settlements, agricultural areas, and gathering places. They represented ancestors, chiefs, and important figures from the community's past, standing eternal watch over their descendants. The archaeological teams made another crucial discovery around the bases of many statues. Scattered in the soil were tools, partially finished carvings, and work materials that appeared to have been abandoned suddenly. Obsidian blades lay where they had been dropped. Stone hammers rested beside unfinished statue surfaces. Ropes and wooden sledge fragments deteriorated in the earth near transportation paths. The scene suggested something unexpected. At some point in the island's history, the work of creating and moving these massive monuments had stopped abruptly. Not gradually wound down, not completed, and then concluded. Simply stopped. Workers had apparently set down their tools and walked away, leaving projects half-finished, statues partially carved, and transportation efforts frozen in place. This evidence pointed toward a dramatic shift in island society, some kind of fundamental change that made continuing the Moai tradition either impossible or unnecessary. But what could cause an entire civilization to abandon their most important cultural practice in what appeared to be a matter of days or weeks? The answer to that question wouldn't come from studying the statues themselves. It would require looking at everything else the excavations were revealing. The soil layers around the buried Moai told their own story. By analyzing the composition and depth of sediment at different levels, geologists could estimate roughly when each layer had been deposited. The results suggested that the burial process had been gradual, taking place over centuries, rather than from a single catastrophic event. The statues had stood in their positions for a very long time, slowly disappearing as the island's landscape changed around them. This raised yet another question that researchers hadn't considered before. If the bodies were being gradually buried, did the people of Easter Island know what was happening? Did they watch as their monuments slowly sank into the earth? And if so, why didn't they excavate around them to keep the full figures visible? Perhaps by the time significant burial had occurred, the knowledge of what lay beneath had already been lost. Or perhaps later generations, facing their own challenges, simply lacked the resources to maintain monuments from an earlier age. Every answer the excavations provided seemed to generate three new questions. The more scientists learned about the Moai, the more complex the picture became. These were not simple stone heads created by a primitive society. They were sophisticated monuments built by a civilization with advanced organizational skills, detailed artistic traditions, and complex spiritual beliefs. And they were only the beginning of what lay hidden beneath Easter Island's surface. The excavation teams working around the Moai were following standard archaeological procedure, carefully documenting every layer of soil they removed. Then, near the quarry site of Rano Raraku, where most of the island's statues had been carved, workers noticed something unusual. The soil in certain areas had an odd reddish tint that didn't match the surrounding volcanic earth. When they dug deeper, they found something nobody had expected. Hidden beneath layers of deliberately placed stones were dozens of carefully constructed pits. Each one had been lined with rocks to create a sealed chamber, and inside these chambers was a bright crimson powder. At first glance, it looked like natural clay deposits, or perhaps oxidized volcanic material. But when samples were sent for laboratory analysis, the results revealed something far more interesting. The red substance wasn't a natural deposit at all. It was a manufactured pigment carefully prepared from specific minerals. Chemical analysis showed it contained high concentrations of hematite and magnetite, both iron-rich minerals that had been processed and ground into an extremely fine powder. Creating pigment of this quality would have required extensive knowledge of mineral properties, careful collection of raw materials, and labor-intensive grinding and processing techniques. What made this discovery particularly significant was the sheer quantity of pigment that had been stored. These weren't small containers for occasional ceremonial use. The pits contained enough processed material to paint hundreds of statues or supply decades of rituals. Someone had invested enormous effort into producing and preserving this substance, treating it as a resource valuable enough to carefully cache underground in sealed containers. The dating of these pigment deposits provided another surprise that challenged existing theories about Easter Island's history. Conventional wisdom held that the island's civilization had collapsed sometime around the 15th or 16th century, following widespread deforestation. According to this narrative, once the trees were gone, the society fell into chaos, unable to sustain its population or continue its cultural practices. But the radiocarbon dating of organic materials found within and around the pigment pits told a different story. These deposits dated to periods well after the island's forests had vanished. The civilization had not collapsed with the loss of its trees. Instead, the society had adapted, reorganized, and continued its ceremonial practices for centuries after the environmental change. People were still producing sacred pigment, still conducting rituals, still maintaining social structures long after the supposed collapse. This evidence forced archaeologists to reconsider the entire timeline of Easter Island's history. The society hadn't experienced a sudden, catastrophic failure. It had transformed, finding new ways to sustain itself even as its environment changed dramatically. The pigment production was just one piece of evidence, showing continued social organization and cultural continuity. Understanding why this particular pigment was so important required looking at Polynesian cultural traditions more broadly. Across Polynesian societies, the color red held profound spiritual significance. It represented divine power, sacred authority, and protection from harmful forces. Red pigments were used in ceremonies marking important life transitions, in preparing bodies for burial, and in sanctifying objects and spaces used for religious purposes. On Easter Island specifically, the red pigment would have been used to paint the Moai during ceremonies, to decorate participants in important rituals, and to mark sacred objects and spaces. The fact that communities continued producing and storing this material even during difficult times demonstrated how central these practices remained to island society. Ceremonial life didn't stop when resources became scarce. If anything, it may have become even more important as a way of maintaining social cohesion during challenging periods. While the pigment discoveries were revealing new information about cultural practices, other excavation teams were making discoveries that would prove even more dramatic. Archaeologists working at several Moai platform sites had noticed that the foundation seemed unusually deep and complex for simple statue bases. When they began carefully excavating beneath the platforms, they discovered something remarkable. These weren't just foundations. They were entrances to constructed spaces beneath the monuments. Sealed chambers had been built into the ground before the platforms were erected above them. The chambers weren't natural caves or simple holes dug into the earth. They were engineered structures, built with carefully selected and positioned stones that created stable, lasting spaces capable of surviving centuries of earthquakes, rainfall, and the immense weight of the monuments above. The precision of the construction was extraordinary. Stones had been shaped and fitted together so tightly that modern researchers struggled to insert even a thin blade between them. No mortar or binding material had been used, yet the chambers remained intact and stable. This level of engineering demonstrated sophisticated understanding of structural principles, weight distribution, and long-term durability. When archaeologists finally accessed these sealed chambers, they found spaces that had remained largely undisturbed for hundreds of years. The contents revealed crucial information about Easter Island society that contradicted many assumptions about the supposed primitive nature of the culture. Inside the chambers lay human remains, carefully positioned and accompanied by grave goods. These weren't mass burials or hastily interred bodies. Each individual had been placed with obvious care and respect. The skeletal remains showed no signs of violence or disease that might indicate a catastrophic population collapse. Instead, they appeared to be deliberate burials of important community members. Alongside the remains were tools crafted with remarkable skill. Obsidian blades showed edges sharp enough to still cut after centuries underground. The volcanic glass had been worked with precision, creating implements for carving, cutting, and detailed work. Some tools showed signs of extensive use and careful maintenance, suggesting they had belonged to master craftspeople who had relied on them throughout their working lives. The presence of jewelry made from shells was particularly revealing. Analysis of these shells showed they came from species that don't live in Easter Island's waters. Some originated from islands thousands of kilometers away. This proved that Easter Island wasn't the isolated, cut-off society that many had imagined. The people maintained trade networks and contact with other islands across vast stretches of ocean. They had access to materials and likely to ideas and knowledge from distant communities. The individuals buried in these chambers clearly held special status. Not everyone received burial beneath the Moai platforms. These locations were reserved for people who had played crucial roles in their communities. The evidence suggested they included religious leaders, master carvers, navigators, and other skilled specialists whose knowledge and authority had been so valued that entire monuments were constructed above their final resting places. Food offerings had been placed in the chambers alongside the bodies. Even after centuries, traces of fish bones, shells from edible mollusks, and residue from plant-based foods remained identifiable. These offerings demonstrated that the deceased continued to be honored and remembered long after their initial burial. Families or communities had returned to leave offerings, maintaining relationships with their ancestors through ongoing ritual practice. The same red pigment discovered in the storage pits appeared throughout these burial chambers. It coated the walls in some areas, creating a symbolic connection between the space and the sacred power the color represented. Some skeletal remains showed traces of pigment on the bones themselves, suggesting that bodies had been painted as part of burial ceremonies. This wasn't simply about disposing of the dead or marking where someone had been laid to rest. The entire process was deeply spiritual, treating burial as an artistic and religious act that required the same sacred materials used in other important ceremonies. The chambers were essentially underground temples, spaces where the living world connected with the realm of ancestors and spiritual forces. Each new discovery raised more questions about what else might lie beneath the island's surface. If elaborate chambers existed under some platforms, might there be more undiscovered spaces elsewhere? What other aspects of this society remained hidden, waiting for careful archaeological work to reveal them? Among the fragments of broken stones scattered around several Moai sites, archaeologists found pieces that initially seemed unremarkable. They appeared to be chunks of white coral, common enough on a volcanic island surrounded by ocean. But when a researcher named Sergio Rapu examined these fragments more carefully in the late 1970s, he realized they weren't random debris. They had been carefully shaped and carved with specific dimensions. These were artificial objects, and their purpose became clear when he held one up to a Moai's face. They were eyes. The discovery fundamentally changed how researchers understood the Moai. These statues had never been meant to appear as blank, featureless giants. They had been given eyes, transforming them from impressive but inanimate stone carvings into figures that could see, watch, and actively participate in the life of the community around them. The implications were profound. If the Moai had eyes, they weren't merely symbols or monuments. They were present, aware entities. The construction of these eyes showed remarkable craftsmanship. The white portions were carved from coral, a material that would have required diving or collecting during low tide. The coral was shaped into smooth, rounded forms that fit precisely into the carved sockets of each statue's face. For the pupils, carvers used either obsidian, the black volcanic glass abundant on the island, or red scoria, another volcanic stone. These dark pupils were positioned in the center of the white coral, creating eyes that would have been visible from considerable distances. When sunlight struck these eyes at certain angles, particularly during dawn or dusk, the effect would have been startling. The statues would have appeared to be looking directly at observers, their gaze following movement, their presence commanding attention. This wasn't accidental. The creators understood the visual impact of their work and designed the eyes to maximize the sense that these figures were alive and watching. The installation of eyes appears to have been the final step in a long process of creating each moai. After carving the statue from the quarry stone, transporting it to its designated location, and erecting it on its platform, the community would have performed a ceremony to install the eyes. This final act brought the statue to life, completing its transformation from carved rock to ancestral guardian. It marked the moment when the Moai began its role as protector and observer of the community. Not every Moai received eyes. The archaeological evidence suggests that only certain statues, presumably those representing the most important ancestors or leaders, were given this final enhancement. This created a clear hierarchy among the monuments themselves. Some ancestors were honored with complete figures that could see and watch over their descendants. Others, perhaps less influential or from less powerful families, remained without eyes. Their honor still recognized, but their presence less active in daily life. The discovery of the eyes also validated oral traditions that had been passed down through generations of Rapa Nui people. Stories told of statues that watched over villages, that could see both protective spirits and harmful forces, that served as intermediaries between the living and the realm of ancestors. Western researchers had often dismissed these accounts as mythological elaborations. The physical evidence proved that the stories contained accurate historical memory. The Moai really had been able to see. While archaeologists were piecing together how the Moai functioned in island society, other researchers were investigating a completely different mystery that had puzzled visitors since the mid-19th century. In 1864, a French missionary named Eugène Hérault became the first outsider to document the existence of wooden tablets covered in strange symbols. These tablets, found in the homes of island residents, bore rows of tiny carved figures arranged in neat lines across the wood surface. Hérault recognized immediately that these weren't decorative objects. The symbols were too regular, too systematic, too deliberately organized. This was writing an actual script representing language. The realization was extraordinary. Writing systems are rare in human history. Most cultures throughout time have relied on oral tradition to preserve and transmit knowledge. The development of writing requires specific social conditions, particular needs, and considerable intellectual achievement. Finding an indigenous writing system on a remote Pacific island challenged assumptions about where and how such systems could emerge. The script became known as rongorongo, named after the Rapa Nui term for the recitation of sacred texts. Each tablet was covered in small figures representing humans, animals, plants, geometric shapes, and abstract symbols. The carvers had used shark teeth and sharp obsidian tools to incise the images into wood with remarkable precision. Some symbols were only a few millimeters tall, yet each one was distinct and carefully formed. One of the most unusual features of rongorongo was how the text was meant to be read. Rather than following lines from left to right or right to left consistently, the script used a method called boustrophédon. A reader would start at the bottom left of the tablet, read across to the right, then turn the tablet upside down and read the next line from left to right again. This alternating pattern continued up the tablet, with each line requiring the reader to rotate the text. The word boustrophédon literally means "as the ox plows," referring to how a plow turns at the end of each furrow to begin the next row. This reading method wasn't unique to Easter Island. Ancient Greek inscriptions sometimes used the same technique, as did a few other early writing systems. But finding it in the Pacific, developed independently from any known contact with these other traditions, demonstrated that the people of Easter Island had created a sophisticated literacy system through their own innovation. The content of these tablets remained frustratingly mysterious. By the time researchers began serious study of rongorongo, only a handful of elderly islanders still claimed any knowledge of how to read it. The traumatic population collapse of the 1800s had broken the chain of transmission. Knowledge that had once been carefully taught to select individuals had died with them, leaving behind texts that could be seen but not understood. Various researchers have proposed theories about what the tablets contained. Some scholars believe they recorded genealogies, the complex family lineages that determined social status and land rights in Polynesian societies. Others suggest they contained religious chants or cosmological information about the creation of the world and the nature of divine forces. Still others have proposed that the tablets might record astronomical observations, historical events, or practical information about agriculture and navigation. Analysis of the wood used for the tablets provided another intriguing clue about Easter Island's past. Several tablets were made from Toromiro wood, a tree species that once grew on the island, but had become extinct there by the time Europeans arrived in significant numbers. This meant the tablets had to have been created before the complete disappearance of the island's forests, pushing their origin back several centuries and confirming that they represented an old tradition, not a recent innovation. The existence of rongorongo forced a complete reevaluation of Pacific Island cultures. For decades, Western scholars had characterized Polynesian societies as pre-literate, relying entirely on oral tradition and memory to preserve knowledge. The discovery proved that at least one Polynesian culture had independently developed written language. This suggested that the intellectual capacity and social organization of these societies had been consistently underestimated. But even as researchers were uncovering evidence of sophisticated cultural achievements from earlier periods, the archaeological record showed something dramatic had happened on Easter Island. Around 1400 CE, perhaps slightly earlier or later depending on which evidence was weighted most heavily, the island society underwent a fundamental transformation. The creation of Moai stopped abruptly, the quarries fell silent, and when ceremonial activity resumed, it centered on something completely different. Evidence of this shift appeared throughout excavation sites. At the Rano Raraku quarry, where most Moai had been carved, archaeologists found nearly 400 statues in various stages of completion. Some were barely begun, rough shapes emerging from the rock face. Others were almost finished, waiting only for final details and transportation. Still others had been partially moved from the quarry before being abandoned along ancient roads. The work had clearly stopped suddenly, not wound down gradually. At the same time this abandonment was occurring, a new ceremonial center was emerging on a different part of the island. At Orongo, a village built on the narrow crater rim of the Ranokau volcano, archaeologists uncovered extensive evidence of a completely different religious tradition. Stone houses clustered along the crater's edge, and the rocks were covered with hundreds of carved petroglyphs, showing a new kind of figure that had never appeared in earlier island art. These carvings depicted beings that were half human and half bird, with human bodies and limbs but bird heads and features. Sometimes they appeared in procession, sometimes in individual portraits, sometimes surrounded by symbols of eggs and ocean birds. This was the Birdman, Makemike's representative on Earth, and the center of a cult that would dominate island life for the next several centuries. The transformation from the Moai tradition to the Birdman cult represented one of the most dramatic religious and social changes documented anywhere in the archaeological record. The Birdman cult wasn't just a change in religious imagery. It represented a complete restructuring of how power and authority functioned on Easter Island. Understanding why this transformation occurred required archaeologists to look carefully at what was happening to the island's environment and society during the centuries when the shift took place. For generations, the standard narrative about Easter Island served as a cautionary tale about environmental destruction. According to this story, the island's inhabitants had recklessly cut down all their trees to transport and erect the massive Moai statues. Once the forests were gone, the society collapsed into warfare and chaos. The population declined dramatically. Starvation became widespread. The culture that had created such impressive monuments destroyed itself through poor resource management. This narrative appeared in textbooks, documentaries, and academic papers. It became the accepted explanation for why statue construction stopped and why the society seemed to have declined. But as archaeological techniques improved and more evidence accumulated, serious problems with this narrative began to emerge. The timing didn't match. The environmental changes didn't align properly with the supposed social collapse. And most importantly, the physical evidence didn't support claims of widespread violence and population catastrophe during the period when the forest disappeared. Detailed excavation of living sites from the 15th through 17th centuries showed continued occupation and organized activity. Agricultural terraces were maintained and expanded. Stone chicken houses were constructed to protect valuable food sources. Garden areas were carefully managed with techniques designed to preserve soil moisture and protect crops from wind. These weren't the actions of a society in collapse. They were adaptations, intelligent responses to changing environmental conditions. Analysis of human remains from this period provided more evidence contradicting the collapse narrative. Researchers examined hundreds of skeletons, looking for signs of violence, malnutrition, and disease that would indicate social breakdown. While they found some injuries consistent with interpersonal conflict, the rates were no higher than in many other pre-industrial societies. There was no evidence of massive warfare or violence on the scale that would be expected if the society had truly descended into chaos. Nutritional analysis of bones showed that people continued to have access to adequate food sources. They adapted their diet as resources changed, relying more heavily on marine foods, chickens, and cultivated crops. The famous story of rampant cannibalism, often cited as evidence of desperation and social breakdown, found little support in the archaeological record. A few ambiguous bone modifications couldn't sustain claims of widespread cannibalism as a response to food shortages. The construction and use of the Orongo Ceremonial Center demonstrated that organized religion and social hierarchy continued long after the forest vanished. The Birdman competition itself required considerable planning and coordination. Each year, representatives from different clans would gather at Orongo to participate in a dangerous ritual. Competitors had to descend the steep cliffs of Rano Kau, swim through shark-infested waters to the small offshore islands of Motu Nui, Motu Iti, and Motu Kau Kau, locate the first egg laid by the sooty-turned seabirds that nested there, and return with the egg intact. The winner of this competition didn't claim power for himself. Instead, his sponsor, typically a chief or important leader from his clan, became the Birdman for the following year. This person held sacred authority and received special privileges. The system created a way for power to shift between different groups regularly, potentially reducing the kind of entrenched inequality that might have been associated with the hereditary status represented by the Moai. This transformation from a system based on ancestral authority to one based on annual ritual competition represented a remarkable social innovation. Rather than fighting over increasingly scarce resources or maintaining rigid hierarchies during difficult times, the island's inhabitants created a new structure that allowed for regular redistribution of power and status. It was an adaptation that maintained social cohesion even as environmental and economic conditions changed. The real catastrophe that devastated Easter Island's population came much later and from an entirely different source. In the 1800s, after European contact had become regular, the island experienced a series of disasters that nearly destroyed its entire population. Slave raiders from Peru attacked repeatedly between 1862 and 1863, kidnapping approximately 1,500 people, roughly half the island's population at the time. These captives were taken to work in mines and on plantations in South America. Most died from the harsh conditions. When international pressure eventually forced the return of survivors, only 15 people made it back alive, and they brought smallpox with them. The disease spread rapidly through the remaining population. Within months, the combination of slave raids, disease, and subsequent epidemics reduced the island's population from several thousand to barely more than 100 individuals. This was the real collapse, and it had nothing to do with environmental mismanagement or resource depletion. It was the direct result of colonial violence and the introduction of diseases against which the isolated population had no immunity. The demographic catastrophe had devastating cultural consequences. When a population drops so dramatically and so suddenly, knowledge disappears. The old people who knew how to read rongo-rongo died without being able to teach new students. Master carvers who understood the techniques for creating and moving moai passed away before they could train successors. Priests who maintained religious traditions and remembered ceremonial procedures left no one capable of continuing their practices. Within a single generation, centuries of accumulated knowledge simply vanished. The survivors faced the challenge of maintaining their identity and culture, with only fragments of what had existed before. Yet despite these overwhelming losses, the Rapa Nui people persisted. They preserved what they could remember, adapted what they could no longer maintain, and fought to keep their identity alive under circumstances that might easily have led to complete cultural extinction. Modern genetic analysis has provided insight into how the population survived and recovered. DNA studies of contemporary Rapa Nui people show clear Polynesian ancestry, confirming that despite the catastrophic population collapse, survivors maintained their heritage. The genetic evidence also reveals some mixing with outside populations during the post-contact period, reflecting the complex and often traumatic history of the island during colonial times. Recent archaeological work has benefited from new technologies that allow researchers to investigate without extensive excavation. Ground-penetrating radar can detect structures and cavities beneath the surface without disturbing them. Three-dimensional laser scanning creates detailed models of statues and sites, preserving precise measurements and revealing weathering patterns and damage that might not be visible to the naked eye. Satellite imagery helps identify patterns across the landscape that are invisible from ground level. These technologies have already revealed that more structures likely remain hidden beneath Easter Island's surface. Anomalies detected by radar suggest additional chambers near some platforms. Subtle variations in vegetation patterns visible from satellites indicate buried features that haven't yet been excavated. Each new discovery adds detail to the picture of what life was like on the island before European contact. The emerging understanding of Easter Island's history tells a very different story from the cautionary tale of environmental collapse. It reveals a society that demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. When their environment changed, they adapted their agriculture, their diet, and their resource use. When their social structures no longer served their needs, they created new ones. When their religious traditions needed to evolve, they developed new ceremonial systems that address contemporary concerns. The Moai themselves stand as testament to this culture's achievements. They represent not failure, but success, proof that a small population on an isolated island created monumental architecture, developed systems of writing, maintained long-distance trade networks, and sustained organized society for centuries. The statues weren't abandoned because the culture failed. They were abandoned because the culture changed, finding new ways to express spiritual beliefs and organize political authority. The message of Easter Island isn't about the dangers of environmental destruction. It's about human creativity, adaptability, and the capacity to maintain cultural identity through tremendous challenges. The Rapa Nui people created something remarkable in one of the most isolated places on Earth. They survived environmental changes, adapted to new circumstances, and persisted through colonial violence that nearly destroyed them completely. Their story, far from being a warning about failure, is actually a testament to resilience and the strength of human culture.